All of the registrants of papers to the conference, and those of you who have come today and have registered late, welcome. I would like to welcome the keynote, the plenary speakers. They were introduced this morning, and I will simply acknowledge Crawford Young over here, and Wayne Nofziger somewhere, and Mikael Karlstrom somewhere, who will be speaking tomorrow. Where? He's here somewhere. Over here. Yeah, okay. And I would like to once again recognize the Senegalese delegation, and I think they are all here now. I think they are all here. This morning I failed to mention Madame Ndai, who came late and is traveling with her husband, Rector Ndai. She is a very special person in Senegal in her own right. She is, well, I will try to pronounce her name, Ndai Koudia Kole. Forgive me, I'm sure it's mangled in some way. She is a representative to the National Assembly in Senegal, so some of the discussion of democracy in Africa that we heard this morning is part of our conference in a very real way. She also represents in the National Assembly is a voice or a spokesperson for the National Association of Senegalese Women. I would ask her to stand. So, I should also, since I see Nelly Ukpokodu here, one of the people working with the teachers today, and Tom Burt over here, who is a high school teacher, also working with the teachers. Thank you for being part of our effort here today. Now I want to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o. Like so many of you, the rest of you, Ngũgĩ's work has been an inspiration to me. I have used some of his early novels as textbooks in courses I have taught on Africa, and for better or for worse, his fiction is awfully good ethnography. And that may say something about the fictionalness of ethnography, but I think that good writing is good writing wherever, whatever genre it is in. But in his recent years, since those early ethnographic works on Kenya, Ngũgĩ has come very far in a direction that he can describe best. Some others of you know this pilgrimage better than I do. There is a biographical sketch, page-and-a-half biographical sketch of him, and a presentation of his major writings in your packet, which we assembled for this occasion. I will not say any more than that. He is a professor at New York University, and the title of his keynote presentation is Europhonism, Universities and the Magic Fountain, the Future of African Literature and Scholarship. Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o.
I'd like to express my appreciation for the invitation, and particularly the persistence of Professor Johnson, who kept up the correspondence between myself and him, and I was so absorbed in writing my new novel that I did not always respond to his messages really in time, but he kept the faith, so to speak. But I'm really very glad to be here, also because of connection with so many people I've already met, friends, old friends, and new ones. And I've been particularly impressed by the fact that many scholars here seem to know not only English and French, but also African languages. I was very impressed the dinner I had last night to hear at least one lady who was speaking French and English, of course, and Wolof. She kept changing from one to the other, quite freely, and that was very, very impressive, for me. I remember that. This conference has also been had a very nice personal encounter last night with a lady from Kenya, I think Ms. Thiong'o, the one who spoke yesterday, because after her presentation, or rather her question last night, she and I talked, and she reminded me that she was the daughter of a student I was with in the elementary school in Kenya. And she was wondering whether I could remember his father. But of course I remembered him immediately, although I have not seen him I don't think we have really met for the last 50 years or so, I think. And I've been wondering what happened to him, because I remember that he had very nice handwriting, which was the envy of everybody. And so it was a very sort of nice, encounter, for me, last, night. Now, in thinking about this conference, I was torn between two possibilities for a speech. I was very tempted to actually come and read from the new novel which I'm writing, or I've been writing for the last 3 years or 2 years, I can't remember, and which really deals with, I believe, the kind of issues which this conference is really about. I'm looking at Africa, particularly post-Cold War Africa, but going over literally this 20th century and probably beyond in that particular novel. But it's a novel which keeps on, it's a kind of runaway train. It keeps on getting bigger and bigger, and I don't know what to do about it just now. When I'm ordered to about 1,147 pages, I don't know what I'm. But it keeps on asking me to be with it all the time, and just now I'm working on a 5th draft. So I was thinking of reading an extract from the novel was one way. Then, so I came with the two speeches. One was literally extract from the novel, and the other one was actually, the topic I'm going to speak on today, which was announced, at the introduction. This particular lecture is actually a variation on a lecture I gave recently at Cambridge University. So it's called the Ashby Lecture, which was given at Clare College, Cambridge University, in May, this year. So this is really basically a variation, on that, because once again, especially after last night and talking to people, I thought actually that this particular lecture would be actually more relevant to this particular, situation, and especially with the presence of so many scholars from Africa. I thought this would be the perfect situation to have a dialogue. So in fact, this speech is in a sense more, in its present form, is more aimed as a kind of dialogue between me and many of the African scholars who are here. So that's how it will be angled, so to speak. But it's for everybody, please. Now, and when I was thinking about that lecture, which I was given in Cambridge, It's named after one of the, I don't know, he was, I think, somehow involved in education in Nigeria, I remember, you know. But anyway, when I was preparing for that lecture, I came across his own book on the issue of African universities and what he called African universities and Western tradition. You know, the book itself was actually the 1964 Godkin lectures he gave at Harvard University. And in reading it, I was struck by the irony in the way the Godkin lectures had crossed my own life. So I became fascinated by the lectures given by the same person about whom, or rather in connection with whom, I was going to give this formal lecture at Clare College, Cambridge. The lectures were given and published in 1964, the year I graduated from Makerere University College with the University of London Honours degree in English. It was also the year that William Heinemann brought out a hardcover edition of my novel, Weep Not Child, written in English, obviously a product of my 5 years at Makerere. My novel and I were products of the kind of universities which Eric Ashby was talking about, and whose social function was, as quoted in his book, to produce men and women with the standards of public service and capacity for leadership which self-rule requires. In short, a governing elite in the expected new political dispensation following the end of the Second World War. Now, because the elite produced by these universities is to a large extent the one in control of the post-colonial state, any discussions of democracy and the state would be incomplete without a look at the role of the universities in the creation, and I hope also in the cure of the current crisis of democracy in Africa. Democracy, in the Lincolnian sense, as the government of the people, by the people, for the people, assumes a knowledgeable populace, and universities are centers of production and distribution of knowledge. To what extent have the universities produced an elite capable of producing knowledge in a manner that reaches and empowers the people in the spirit of the saying that knowledge is power? And that's why I have entitled my talk, Europhonism, Universities and the Magic Fountain, the future of African literature and scholarship, because this literature and scholarship, has a role to play in the evolution of a democratic Africa, an Africa accountable to the people. The colleges, and I'm going to use the English, my examples will largely come from the English-speaking world because of familiarity with our tradition, but I hope what I say applies equally well to, at least in the spirit, to those colleges and universities which were, say, part of the other colonizing traditions in Africa. The colleges were established in the 50s, the culmination of a series of committees and recommendations going back to the 1925 Advisory Committee that years later metamorphosed into the Asquith Committee and the Inter-University Council for Higher Education. But the vision of a modern university in Africa did not begin in the 20th century with these official committees, but rather in 19th century with first James Africanus Beale Horton in 1868 and with Edward Blyden in 1872. Both Horton and Blyden were of African descent, both from Sierra Leone, and they clearly wanted the best for Africa. Nevertheless, their two versions were different. According to Ashby, Horton wanted to introduce into Africa undiluted Western education, and there was no place in his scheme of higher education for the incorporation of African languages, history, or culture. End of the quote. The way to African modernity lay by way of the classics and European languages and culture. Blyden, on the other hand, wanted to free higher education in Africa from what he calls despotic Europeanizing, which had warped and crushed the Negro spirit. Writing in 1883, he said, "All our traditions and experiences are connected with a foreign race. We have no poetry but that of our taskmasters. The songs which live in our ears and are often on our lips are the songs we heard sung by those who shouted while we groaned and lamented. They sang of their history, which was a history of our degradation. They recited their triumphs, which contained the record of our humiliation. To our great misfortune, we learned their prejudices and their passions, and thought that we had their aspirations and their power." End of the quote. He wanted a system of education which rejected all the errors and falsehoods about Africa, and while he wanted the Greek and the Latin classics as part of the curricula for his visions of an African university, he also wanted African languages to be an integral part of it. J.E. Casely Hayford of Ghana, then Gold Coast, was to go further than Blyden, and in his Ethiopia Unbound of 1911, he articulated visions of an African university in which the medium of instruction would be an African language, and in his case, he proposed that scholars would be employed to translate books into African languages. When eventually universities were set up in Africa following the recommendations of the Asquith Committee, and we've got a number of them, like Ibadan in 1948, University of Gold Coast in 1948, Makerere University College in 1950. It was the, if you like, the Horton version which triumphed, except that where Greek and Latin had been envisioned as the foundation of excellence, English took over as the foundation of that excellence. And at the risk of simplification, I shall call this the Horton-Asquith model, to contrast it with the Blyden-Hayford model. What divided the Horton-Asquith model and the Blyden-Casely-Hayford version of an African university was clearly not their disagreement about the need for excellence in the pursuit of higher education, but rather the way of achieving it. And the question of African languages was central. In the Horton-Asquith model, African languages were relegated to the periphery, and in the Blyden-Hayford model, they would occupy a central place in the scheme of things. Periphery, or the center. That was a great divide, and the implications of the model which triumphed and the one which failed to make the grade still haunt African scholarship in particular, and in particular African literature, with even more enormous implications for democracy in the Africa of the 21st century. In short, the question as to whether African languages occupy center stage or the periphery is the number one priority as Africa struggles for a more equitable place in the economic and political map of the global community of the 21st century. Language, as I have argued in several places, occupy a significant position in the entire hierarchy of the organization of wealth, power, and values in a society. Language is a product of a community in its economic, political, and cultural evolution in time and space. In their very negotiation with nature and with one another, humans give birth to a system of communication whose highest expression and development is the science which we come to give the name of language. And as I was arguing last night, language for me is also a way of organizing space, which we have in common, but different languages organize that space slightly differently. So language is also the producer of a community, for it is language, after all, which enables humans to negotiate effectively their way into and out of nature, and indeed that which makes possible their multifaceted evolution. It is in that very negotiation that a community comes to know itself as a specific community different from others. This is because in doing similar things of a similar natural environment with similar regulations which govern what is extracted from nature, how it is extracted, and how it is shared out, such a community develops knowledges which are passed from generation to generation and which become the basis of their future actions and the staff of their way of life. Every community has a way of life, a way of what, how, and when it negotiates with nature, with one another, and with other communities, we say the self and the universe. Language carries the cultural universe of the community, and in that universe also resides the entire body of values held by that community. Every community of humans with a given particularity has notions of what is right and wrong, of the bad and the good, of the ugly and the beautiful. In short, a system of ethics and aesthetics, the entirety of which, with associated feelings, emotions, and attitudes, forms the basis of their identity, or rather their being for themselves. Let me explain a little bit about this being for themselves. In his science of logic and in the phenomenology of the spirit, as indeed in all his works, Hegel, the 19th century German philosopher, often talked of the notions of being and becoming, making the distinction between being in itself and being for itself, notions which Jean-Paul Sartre also plays with in his book Being and Nothingness, further talking about possibilities of being for others. We can think of being in itself as when an entirety exists objectively and undifferentiated, as opposed to being for itself when it becomes aware of itself as an entity. We can think of language as that which helps in the movement of a community from the state of being in itself, from being in itself to a state of being for itself. And this sense of its self-awareness is what gives the community its spiritual strength to keep on reproducing its being as it continually renews itself in culture, in its power relations, and in its negotiations with an entire environment. It is its culture which enables a community to imagine and reimagine itself in history. And that's why a culture is to a community what a flower is to a plant. A flower is very beautiful, very colorful. It is the flower which often readily defines the identity of so many plants. A flower is also very delicate. But most important, it is the flower which is the carrier of the seeds which make it possible the reproduction of the roots and trunks of that plant. Kill the tree trunk and even the roots, but retain the seeds, and the tree can reproduce itself. It can, if you like, reimagine itself. Language, which is the carrier of culture, is the ultimate and the most primary means of imagination. Now, we know that empire builders have always known that, and in trying to shape how the dominated imagined their future, they clearly saw the importance of delinking the elites of the dominated communities from their languages and literally transplanting the minds in the languages of the imperial center. And where the traditional elite resisted the transplant because they were too rooted in their languages and cultures, the empire builders simply manufactured a new elite through a massive cultural surgery carried out in the theaters of the new schools and colleges. The aim, realized or not, was to turn them into beings for others, even in their conception of themselves. Examples abound, and we don't even have to go to the special case of plantation slavery, where whole communities were delinked from the languages of their original homes. We can also cite colonial India, British India, because of its neutrality, because its centrality in the making of modern Britain, became a social laboratory, with the results later transplanted to other colonies. When I was doing research for my novel, which I've been talking about, and because some of the action takes place in India, in Africa, in the New World, New York also. I did some research on Madras, because my character went for education in Madras University, and that was the first setting of the British India Company, I believe. Now, one of the earliest governors of that particular area of Fort George was somebody called Elihu Yale, and the money that he made in Madras that went into foundation of Yale University, and that's why Yale is called Yale. So the Yale University actually is somehow connected with colonial India in some ways. And so, because of the centrality of India in that whole situation, the words of Thomas Babington Macaulay, who as a member of the Supreme Council of India helped reform the colony's education system, as well as drawing its penal code, have a special significance for us today. You remember that in the famous minute on Indian education, he had versions of English language producing, I quote, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Here we can note that this was not for the aesthetic pleasure of disinterested cultural engineering, but rather the hope was that this class of persons, and I quote, may be interpreters between us and the people we govern. Exactly 87 years later, Macaulay's words were to be repeated in colonial Kenya by the then British governor, Sir Philip Mitchell, in outlining a policy for English language dominance in African education, literally as a moral crusade to supplement the armed crusade against the Mau Mau guerrilla army. He saw this new language education as bringing about, and I quote, a civilized state in which the values and standards are to be the values and standards of Britain, in which everyone whatever his origins, has an interest and a part. In both instances, Macaulay's India in 19th century and Mitchell's Kenya in 20th century, the context was colonial and the aim was clear. But as in the military realm, the colonial powers had carved out just as in the military realm, the colonial powers had carved out a native army simultaneously alienated from the people whence they came and collaborative with the forces of their own conquest. The same would be true in the realm of the mind. Create from the governed an intellect both alienated and collaborative. You create a being not for itself, but being for others, and therefore in some ways against its own being. The Horton Asquith model had a whole colonial tradition and theory behind it, and the model was inherited almost unaltered in the era of independence. And it was a product of the Macaulay system of education, who spread out to fill the vacant places of white judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, lawmakers, governors, military leaders, and heads of departments of education in most of Africa. And what an inheritance for Africa. It was an interesting twist of fate that those nurtured in the colonial mold would hold the key in molding the new nations in the military, educational, and economic realms. It's ironic also, but very interesting, to compare the position of the elites who, before the setup of Asquith-type colleges in Africa, were educated in London, Paris, and Washington. These lit the fires of nationalism and Pan-Africanism and the politics of cultural identities as in the concepts of negritude and African personality. Whether they spoke African languages or not, they still paid homage to them, as in the case of Nyerere translating the works of Shakespeare into Kiswahili, or Kwame Nkrumah setting up the Bureau of African Languages, or Birago Diop and Sheikh Diop stressing the centrality of African languages in the self-emancipation of Africa. But the products of the Asquith-type colleges embraced English language with an almost religious fervor as the language of modernization and respect in the global community. In various ways, they argued and sought to convince themselves that English was now an African language. In other words, here I'm just making a distinction between the elite who are produced after 1948, roughly speaking, by colleges within, and those others who are educated in many universities here, the ones who later went back to Africa and raised high the banner of African nationalism and so on. The result is really a paradox. Systems of education entrusted by the new nations to reach such ideas of emancipating and modernizing Africa, and for which process the new nations invest a good percentage of GNP, now brings up brilliant intellects in every field of modern learning, and yet they cannot put even a summary of what they have acquired in any African language. There's no doubt that these colleges, particularly in their heydays, have produced a remarkable scholarship. African scholarships, whose first degrees were often were acquired in the colleges of the Horton Asquith model, are to be found in major universities in Africa and abroad. But they are clearly alienated intellects, exiles at home and abroad, or rather exiles in search of a place they can truly claim as their own. In the sense of the collective social body, they become beings for others, but not beings for themselves, or at the very least, beings against themselves, against the very soil that gave birth to them. African language communities pays for intellects which cannot put a single idea, even about agriculture, or health, or business, or democracy, or finance, into the very languages which gave them birth. This paradox of African scholarship in general is best mirrored in the particular case of the production of African literature. Because English was so central to all aspects of learning in the new colleges, the English departments were very prestigious, and quite frankly, it is difficult to quite express in words the tremendous prestige with which a good performance in English was held. Students of English were the elite of the elite, and a first-class degree in English was simply the first among equals. The history of English literature, what J.P. Clark describes as ranging from Spencer to Spender, although after making this statement I was corrected, and I understand the person who coined this phrase, from Spencer to Spender, was actually Abiola Irele, now professor of, at Ohio University. Yeah. So the history of English literature, what J.P. Clark and Abiola Irele call from Spencer to Spender, was at the center of that curriculum. Since all the new colleges were largely external affiliates of the University of London, they virtually offered the same history, the same authors, whether one went to the English department at Makerere in Uganda or Ibadan in Nigeria. And that's why in the Ashby description of the rise of these universities, I could see myself so clearly. I was definitely a product of the Houghton-Asquith model, as were indeed nearly all the pioneering writers of the 50s and 60s. They were products of the English department, and often their initial inspiration were triggered by the admiration or disagreements with the models they read, a practice J.P. Clark once again described as the example of Shakespeare in one of his texts. Now, a cursory glance at some of the early titles of African fiction tells the story. Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and Also No Longer at Ease, from Yeats' Second Coming, and Eliot's Journey of the Magi. The title of my own first published novel, Weep Not Child, was taken from Walt Whitman. And I'm sure that within the narratives of poetry, it's possible to hear echoes of Thomas Hardy, Dickens, D.H. Lawrence, Conrad, Eliot, Ezra Pound, and so on. In his essay, named for Victoria, Queen of Chinua Achebe tells us that his initial motivation to write came from his encounter with some appalling novels about Africa, including Joyce's Carey's Mr. Johnson. And he decided, I quote, that the story we had to tell could not be told for us by anybody else, no matter how gifted or well-intentioned. End of the quote. But here, in this lecture, I'm not so much concerned with the impact of the models as much as the language in which we produced our reactions to those models. One of the biggest achievements of the Houghton-Asquith model was therefore the production of an African literature in English, but ironically, one often motivated by the Blydenian vision of a positive affirmation of the African image. In 1883, he had written, I quote, "In all English-speaking countries, the mind of the intelligent Negro child revolts against the descriptions given in elementary books, geographies, travels, novels, histories of the Negro. But though he experiences an instinctive revulsion from the caricatures and misrepresentations, he is obliged to continue, as he grows in years, to study such pernicious teachings. After leaving school, he finds the same things in newspapers, in quasi-scientific works, And after a while, they begin to seem the proper things to say about his race, and he accepts what at first his unbiased feelings naturally and indignantly repelled, but of repetition he comes to accept. Such, he says, is the effect of repetition. Having embraced, or at least assented to these errors and falsehoods, he continues, about himself, he concludes that his only hope of rising in the scale of respectable manhood is to strive after whatever is most unlike himself and most alien to his taste. End of the quote. Now, these words are really not much different in terms of from those of Chinua Achebe, when he wrote that if I were God, this, of course, in his famous essay, The Novel is a Teacher, I would regard as the very worst our acceptance, for whatever reason, of racial inferiority. And he went on to define his role as a writer as that of an educator trying to help, and I quote, my society regain belief in itself and put away the complexes of the years of denigration and self-denigration. Thus, this literature had two contradictory tendencies. It was often motivated and driven by the nationalistic and racial pride inherent in the assumptions of the Blyden model. And yet, its models were often the English authors read in class. Written in English, it has nevertheless become to be the nearest thing to a common Pan-African heritage. When Wole Soyinka won the Nobel Prize for Literature, his achievement and recognition were celebrated in many parts of Africa, Kenya for instance. Names of writers like Chinua Achebe, Amata Aidu, Kwai Ama are known and respected in the four corners of the continent. Because of the models of its inspiration, the 19th century Victorian novel, with its natural realism and linear narrative structures, for instance, the literature, and particularly the narratives, tend to be conservative, almost imitative in form, and yet very pertinent in their descriptions of the concerns of the 20th century Africa. Even in form, it feels different and innovative compared with the models of its imitation. And these are some of the contradictions we find. Very positive, negative elements combined together. But what gives this literature its innovative sense? It cannot be the models which inspired it, either in anger or in pleasure. And this brings us to the major paradox. For what gives it that innovative difference is surely its relationship to African languages and the great heritage of orature in those languages. These languages are a reservoir of images, proverbs, riddles, ballads, stories from which this literature in English draws freely and often creatively. Among the Igbo, Achebe wrote in Things Fall Apart, the proverb is like the palm wine with which words are eaten. These languages, that is African languages, are really the magic fountain from which African literature in English or French or Portuguese draws, and which gives it a perpetual youthfulness. The paleness arising from its imitation and the use of English to represent the realized speech of the characters is immediately refreshed in color by the stamina and blood it draws from African languages. All this, its Pan-African reach, its racial pride, its champion of human and democratic values, is the most positive side of what I now call Europhone African literature. Its Europhonity is, of course, a direct product of the Houghton-Asquith model, and so whatever is positive in it would justify Houghton's hope that the great achievement of the classics and Western civilization would generate excellence in the African recipients. But Europhonism has no language or a cultural of its own. the literature it generates, Europhone literature, is given identity in the marketplace of all writings in European tongues by all the reservoir of images in African life and languages. It is therefore also a negative, almost parasitic side to it. So in a way, like a leech, it sucks blood and stamina from African languages, and it never gives anything back to the people who created those languages, in the first instance. The two tendencies inherent in Europhone African literature are actually true of all the scholarship produced by the Houghton Asquith model. They take away from the African heritage and produce great scholarly works on many aspects of African history and landscape, most of which are now to be found in libraries all over the world. There's also a parasitic aspect on this scholarship, which knows only how to take away, but never how to give anything back to the languages and the people on whose behalf it makes its claim in the global community of scholarship in the arts, sciences, and technology. But worse is the fact that knowledges of Africa, the results of extensive research, inventions, and discoveries about Africa, even by the sons and daughters of the continent, are actually stored in European language granaries. We can now see the implications of the Houghton Asquith model. A people can be deprived of wealth and even power. But one of the worst deprivations is a means of achieving all that, articulating it, and therefore developing a vision and a strategy for fighting it out. We can, of course, blame it on colonialism. And believe me, I've done my share of blaming in many of my publications. But remember, or rather we should remember that we cannot accuse colonialism of failing to do what it was clearly not meant to do. Colonialism and colonial models were never meant to develop the colonies for the benefit of the colonized. So we cannot accuse them of failing to do that. And that's why I think it's time that African scholarship and the university began to question that kind of model and its legacy of language, policy, and practice. I have said elsewhere how I find it contradictory in Africa today and elsewhere in the academies of the world to hear of scholars, and here I must say Kansas University, very, very, I was impressed by what is happening here, so this may not apply to here. But anyway, I have sort of been alarmed, when you hear of scholars of African realities, but who do not know a word of the languages of the environment of which they are experts. And my question has been, do you think that any university outside Africa, or rather outside the question of African universities, or even within Africa itself, would give me a job as professor of French literature if I confessed that I did not know a word of French? I'd be kicked out. I would not even be given an interview. And yet schools in Africa and abroad are peopled by experts, whether African or not, whether sympathetic to the African cause or not, whether progressive or not, who do not have to demonstrate any acquaintance, let alone any expertise in African language. They hold chairs and produce PhDs without the requirements of an African language. But it's difficult to blame it on these institutions abroad when they are merely taking the lead from the practice of African universities on their own soil. The result is the marginalization of African languages in the academy at home. So African languages, this is the most amazing thing, African languages have no place in their own home. Imagine you go home and you don't find a bed in your own home. Where do you look for a Where do you go to? I mean, it's the most devastating, situation. African language have no place at home. They do not control their home because their home base is ruled by tongues from Europe. But the same holds true for African languages at the global level. The culture and thought of the 20th century global community is largely dominated by a handful of European languages. Even the United Nations Organization and its agencies assume the centrality of European languages in international relations. In fact, apart from the Arabic, there's no other African-based language in all its agencies. In this respect, I find the words of Haunani K. Trask. She's a lady from Hawaii, and she's very much involved in the sovereignty movement in Hawaii. And she has a book called From a Native Daughter. So I'm quoting from the book. In her book, From a Native Daughter, she argues that indigenous languages replaced by colonial ones result in the creation of dead languages. But what is dead or lost is not a language, but the people who once spoke it and transmitted their mother tongues to succeeding generations. So everywhere, it's as if European language, and these are not her words, everywhere, it's as if European languages have come shouting the often quoted words from Bhagavad Gita, I am become death, the shatterer of worlds. Now, we think of death too narrowly in terms of physical disappearance. Death comes in many forms, and there is the equally devastating cultural death, and we Africans already provide a good example of such a possibility. Over the last, in other words, you can see that, say, in our naming systems or in many other areas, over the last 400 years, we've seen Africans in the West lose their names completely, so that our existence is in terms of Jones, James, Jones, James, and all that. Now, every achievement in sports, in academia, in the sciences and the arts, goes to reinforce European naming systems and cultural personality. Language, of course, is the most basic of naming systems. And with the loss of our languages will come the loss of our entire naming system, and every historical intervention, no matter how revolutionary, will then be within an European naming system, enhancing its capacities for ill or good. Thus, in what she or he does, they will be performing their being for the enrichment of the cultural personality of white Europe. For me, then, the question of languages goes to the heart of the very being and existence of the African, or for that matter, any community deprived of its languages. That's why I now regard Europhonism as the most dangerous intellectual system for the development of Africa. Its logical development is the complete wiping off of African personality in the global cultural map, and becomes simply one of several branches in the European language system. And the only struggle is for the recognition of equal worth of all the cultural branches of a European global whole. Perhaps it is time that African scholars seriously took another look at the Blyden vision. The Blyden-Hayford model rejects the assumptions underlying the relationship of Africa to the world, which equate knowledge, modernity, modernization, civilization, progress, development, democracy, whatever the name, to an acquisition of European languages. There are hundreds of languages in Africa and the world, each of which is a unique store of memories and thoughts and experiences which are of benefit to human life. It is true that the current revolutions in information and technologies daily shrink the globe into McLuhan's global village. But they also, quite frankly, open possibilities of expansion of the human community. Academic and other cultural institutions should be among the first to sensitize the world community to the existence and reality of knowledges in diverse languages of the world. There are, of course, practical difficulties in implementing policies that realize fully the plurality and diversity of languages, but there should be conscious efforts by various disciplines to recognize the existence of knowledges in languages from places other than, say, Europe, and find ways of tapping into the knowledges thereby contained, and in the process help in the dialogue among languages. Dialogue among languages is definitely one way of giving back to any languages from which we draw sustenance. And there are moves in that direction. In other words, really for European languages, we can actually have an interesting exchange between African languages and European languages. It does not mean kind of necessarily that one must necessarily mean exclusion, of the other. In 1996, I attended a conference in Barcelona, Spain, organized in part by the International PEN, and which came with the Universal Declaration of Linguistic Rights, based on the recognition of the need for equality and dialogue among languages, big and small. But for Africa, the question of languages goes beyond that of simply sensitizing the world to the plurality of languages, and it goes to the very heart of our being and existence. And that's why I've always taken it that the main challenge is to African scholars and writers and universities to act as pathfinders. It is this consciousness that made me turn to Gikuyu language for creative endeavors. And now I reach a position where I know I cannot go back. I work at the New York University, and there I have just finished, or rather I'm in the 5th draft of the novel I was talking about, which is currently 1,142 pages, and is roughly called The Wizard of the Crow. For those who know Kikuyu, it's called Morogi wa Kagogo. I've also founded a journal with the help of New York University in the Gikuyu language. It's called Motiri, and in which I publish papers on every aspect of development, hoping that the journal will act as an inspiration for more journals in African languages. Then I see a very exciting possibility for mutual exchange among such journals, making possible through translations a genuine dialogue among African languages. There's also the Conference on Literature and African Languages due to be held in Asmara, Eritrea in January at the beginning of the new millennium. The conference, it is hoped, will bring together writers from every country in Africa who write in African languages. But it's also hoped that many scholars will attend the conference to confront the question of African languages and knowledge and scholarship. The conference is being organized by Africa World Press with the support of a number of universities, including New York University, Penn State universities, and also quite a number of foundations. Because African languages have been invisible, the conference will raise, we hope, their visibility. And we hope that this will not be the first of many, because what has been happening in the past is that African languages and what is producing African languages have had no visibility whatsoever. You can have a writer who has been writing in African language, and then you get one writer who writes one novel, say, in English, and that one becomes better known, say, internationally, than the ones who have been writing several books in a particular African language, and so on. So there's greater visibility for one, and relative invisibility for the other. But the conference will also pose a challenge to African scholarship in Africa and the world. But most important will be the celebration of the continued writing in African languages despite all the odds stacked against them. I started by quoting from the Godwin lectures which Eric Ashby gave in Harvard. The book he published in 1964 opens with 2 quotations, one of which is taken from a dispatch to the Governor General of India in 1954, in which he declares that the education they intend to impose on India is that of the sciences, arts, philosophy, and literature of Europe. In short, European knowledge. Again, the same kind of Houghton model. Another quotation is from the 1959 Charter of the University of Ghana. By then, Ghana was independent, and the charter saw the university as taking its place among the foremost universities in the world. As a great seat of African learning, it shall give leadership to African thought, scholarship, and development. And I'm sure that that lofty ideal would still be shared by many African institutions and scholars. But the question of African languages is primarily to that leadership in thought, scholarship, and development. And I hope that all the African scholars and writers present will heed that call. And we are very lucky that in this conference there are some heads of institutions in Africa and even some members of parliament. So we are sure now, from after this conference, there will be a complete change in the direction we are taking. Very lucky. So let's go back to the magic fountain and draw that which gives power and knowledge to the real agents of social change in the continent, the ordinary man and woman, who probably only knows or speaks their own languages. When African writers reject Europhonism as the only way of performing their being, they bring about genuine revolution in their literature in both content and form. Then we can draw from whatever sources elsewhere to add to the fountains instead of always drawing from it and taking away. We shall link with the globe without delinking from our world. It is then that Africa will say with Martin Carter of Guyana, when he says in one of his poems that I come from the nigger yard of yesterday, leaping from the oppressor's hate and the scorn of myself. I come to the world with scars upon my soul, wounds on my body, fury in my hands. I turn to the histories of men and the lives of the peoples. I examine the shower of sparks, the wealth of dreams. I'm pleased with the glories and sad with the sorrows, rich with the riches, poor with the loss. From the nigger yard of yesterday, I come with my burden. And I hope that all the African scholars and writers present will heed that call. And we are very lucky that in this conference there are some heads of institutions in Africa and even some members of parliament. So we are sure now, from after this conference, there will be a complete change in the direction we are taking. Very lucky. So let's go back to the magic fountain and draw that which gives power and knowledge to the real agents of social change in the continent, the ordinary man and woman, who probably only knows or speaks their own languages. When African writers reject Europhonism as the only way of performing their being, they bring about genuine revolution in their literature in both content and form. Then we can draw from whatever sources elsewhere to add to the fountains instead of always drawing from it and taking away. We shall link with the globe without delinking from our world. It is then that Africa will say with Martin Carter of Guyana, when he says in one of his poems that I come from the nigger yard of yesterday, leaping from the oppressor's hate and the scorn of myself. I come to the world with scars upon my soul, wounds on my body, fury in my hands. I turn to the histories of men and the lives of the peoples. I examine the shower of sparks, the wealth of dreams. I'm pleased with the glories and sad with the sorrows, rich with the riches, poor with the laws. From the nigger yard of yesterday, I come with my burden. To the world of tomorrow, I turn with my strength. I believe now, more than ever, that Africa must use its languages and peoples as a strength with which it can leap into tomorrow. And African scholars and writers can lead the way as we enter the 21st century. At the very least, they should make easier access to knowledge and information by the population, an access so necessary for the workings out of the Lincolnian version of democracy in Africa. Thank you.